It starts on an ordinary afternoon or so, they thought. When a police unit makes a reckless decision that ends with a young black girl shot, they assume they'll control the story, the headlines, the outcome. But what they don't know is who her father really is. He's not just a grieving dad, he's a retired Delta Force commander with skills training and a past the system should have never crossed. What unfolds next is more than retaliation. It's a clash between truth and cover-up power, and accountability, silence, and legacy. And believe me, this isn't the kind of story where the ending is easy to guess. You'll feel every moment. So grab a seat, turn the volume up, and let yourself get pulled into a story of loss, reckoning, and unstoppable resolve. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. On a quiet Thursday evening in late October, Colonel Darius Whitmore stood by the doorway of his modest kitchen watching the reflection of his daughter Autumn flicker across the glass of the oven. She was seated at the upright piano they'd kept since she was 6, her fingers dancing over the keys with an ease that came only from years of morning practice and late-night discipline. The soft melody drifted through the air like memory itself, rising and falling with grace, as if the notes carried fragments of their past. Her mother's laughter, the creak of an old swing, set the scent of cinnamon pancakes on snowed-in mornings. Darius said nothing at first. He simply watched his broad shoulders, resting against the doorframe. Arms crossed the lines on his face, deepened by the warm kitchen light. "You've been working that Chopin all week," he finally said, his voice low, and even the kind of voice that once issued battlefield orders, but now held only fatherly pride. Autumn didn't look up, but a small smile played at the corner of her mouth. "I almost have it perfect," she replied, her tone focused, yet soft eyes never leaving the sheet music in front of her. "One more run-through and I'll stop, promise." Darius chuckled quietly, stepping over to the stove to stir the pot of lentil stew that had been simmering since late afternoon. The rich aroma of cumin, garlic, and smoked paprika filled the room, grounding the space, with comfort, with care, with time that had been earned and protected. That evening was like so many others, yet Darius felt something in his chest that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't dread, not yet, but a heaviness, the weight of a world that often didn't make space for quiet, brilliant black girls, with sharp minds and golden hearts. Autumn was 17, now taller than her mother had been, with the same dimple in her left cheek and the same unshakable will. She'd been accepted into 3 Ivy League prep summer programs, had just won first place in a statewide essay competition on civil liberties, and was preparing for her audition at Juilliard, which sat like a shining goal on the horizon of her dreams. Still, even with all she'd accomplished, Darius knew the world saw her first as something else, someone to question, to watch, to stop. Later that night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, the television muted the house, quiet except for the gentle tap of rain beginning against the windows. Autumn leaned back in her chair, fingers tracing the rim of her glass of water. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. Her voice had that tone she used when something deeper lay beneath the question. Darius met her gaze. Miss what he asked, though he already knew. "The field," she said. "Command. Being out there. Knowing exactly who the enemy is." He studied her for a long moment, the way her hands stayed still, the way her eyes didn't waver. Sometimes he answered finally, "But I don't miss not knowing if I'd make it home to you. That part I never got used to." There was a beat of silence between them, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then Autumn said, "I think I want to double major music and political science." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Political science," she nodded. "I want to understand power, not just feel it pressing down." He smiled then, not the wide kind, but the kind that softens the whole face. "Your mom would have loved that. She'd say you're carrying on the fight." Autumn leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to live in a world where being excellent isn't the only way to be safe." After dinner, they cleared the table together in practiced rhythm, passing plates, rinsing spoons, drying with the worn green dish towel her mother had bought the year Autumn was born. The rain outside had grown steadier, the kind of fall rain that soaks the earth but never thunders. Upstairs in her room, Autumn packed her satchel for the school leadership council meeting the next evening. Her violin case rested in the corner, and next to it, the framed photograph of her and Darius standing outside the courthouse after she spoke at a youth justice rally. Her speech had gone viral for a few days, just enough to draw angry emails from anonymous names and quiet pride from every teacher in the district. Downstairs, Darius sipped his chamomile tea, reviewing patient files for tomorrow's shift at the trauma center, his reading glasses low on his nose, the lamplight catching the silver in his hair. He paused, once looked up toward the ceiling toward her room, and for a moment that nameless weight pressed again on his chest. He couldn't place it. He didn't try. He only reached over, switched off the lamp, and let the quiet settle like a blanket around the room. By the time the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, the house was still the world outside, hushed beneath layers of mist and autumn leaves. Upstairs, Autumn slept peacefully, her breath slow, and even unaware of how little time remained in the world as she knew it. And down below, Darius sat alone in the darkened living room, watching the shadows shift against the walls, thinking of the years behind them, of the fragile balance they had built, and of all the things he could not control, no matter how many enemies he had once known how to face. The rain had started falling sometime after 8, soft, at first almost hesitant, like it wasn't sure if it wanted to stay. By the time Autumn Whitmore turned left onto Brentmore Drive, the wipers on her mother's old Lexus were working double time, pushing sheets of water across the windshield. As she leaned slightly forward, knuckles white on the steering wheel, the glow of her phone screen dim in the cup holder beside her. She was still wearing her school blazer over a cream sweater, her skirt-pressed hair pulled into a low twist, as neat and intentional as everything she did. The school meeting had run late, and though she was technically still within curfew, Autumn knew her father would be watching the time, the way only former Delta officers and widowed fathers could. She kept the music low, just a soft hum of Miles Davis drifting from the speakers, filling the space between raindrops and headlights, grounding her in something warm and familiar. Her mind was half on the road and half on the next week's debate. Finals replaying counterpoints, and transitions the way she always did when driving alone. She didn't notice the patrol car behind her until its headlights cut closer, brighter, filling her rearview mirror with sharp light and vague unease. Her first thought wasn't guilt, she wasn't speeding, but the strange pressure that always settled in her chest whenever flashing lights appeared behind her. Not fear exactly, but a tension like held breath, like waiting for something unfair to become irreversible. She flicked on her turn signal, slowed, and pulled to the curb, as the cruiser followed close its lights, now fully engaged, casting blue and red across the wet street, like strobe reflections in a cracked mirror. Autumn tapped the emergency flashers, took a long breath through her nose, and reached slowly for her phone. She had promised her dad she would always call, if she were ever pulled over, and she'd promised herself she wouldn't hesitate. He answered on the first ring. Autumn, Darius said, his voice alert clipped, even though he was 3 miles away and barefoot in the kitchen. "Talk to me. I'm on Brentmore and Oakwood," she said, steady but low. "I don't know why they stopped me. I'm parked. My hands are visible. Music's off." "Keep the line open," he said. "Do not hang up. Whatever happens, I want to hear everything." She nodded, forgetting for a moment that he couldn't see her. The rain was coming in sideways through her cracked window, now the cold drops dampening the sleeve of her blazer. Through the side mirror she could see 2 figures approaching, one taller, heavier, with a flashlight already raised. The other slimmer, newer, hesitant in the way someone moves when they haven't yet learned how to fake certainty. The taller officer tapped the glass twice, sharp and impatient. "Evening, officers," Autumn said, rolling the window further down and lifting both hands back to the steering wheel. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "License and registration," the taller man said, ignoring the question completely. His voice was dry, practiced, and utterly disinterested. "Your tail light's out." "It isn't," Autumn replied calmly. "I just had the car inspected last week. The left light flickers sometimes, but it's not out." The younger officer, standing just behind and to the side, glanced at the back of the vehicle, but said nothing. Rain dripped steadily from the brim of his hat, his shoulders hunched like he didn't want to be there. Darius, listening through speakerphone, stayed silent, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as he traced a line of cracked plaster above the kitchen light. "My license is in my wallet inside the front pocket of my backpack," Autumn said slowly, her voice deliberate. "It's on the passenger seat. My registration's in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for both now, okay?" The taller officer rested a hand on his holstered weapon, the gesture subtle but not lost on her. "Go ahead," he muttered, eyes narrowing slightly. Autumn narrated each movement. "I'm reaching with my right hand toward the seat. I'm unzipping the top pocket of the bag. Pulling out my wallet now." She moved slowly, carefully, just like her father had taught her. And then, in a split-second shift that would later fracture an entire city, the officer shouted, "She's reaching!" There was a pause, not in real time but in perception, the kind of moment where the brain races ahead of the body. Autumn froze, mid-motion, fingers still hovering near the backpack zipper, eyes wide, mouth parting to speak. But no words came. Just the sound of 6 sharp cracks, the flash of muzzle bursts reflecting off wet pavement, and a scream cut short, rising like smoke into the night. Darius heard it all, the echo of shots, the silence that followed, and then the stammered voice of the rookie officer calling it in. Shots fired. Suspect down. Suspect down. Not daughter, not girl, not student, just suspect. The phone slipped from Darius's hand and clattered to the floor, the tinny echo of the line still open, still humming with static and storm. And somewhere not far from where the rain fell and the sirens began, Autumn Whitmore's last breath hung in the air, unseen, unanswered, and unforgettable. The sound of gunfire over a phone call is not something a father should ever have to recognize, but Darius Whitmore did instantly, completely, and with a clarity that cracked him open from the inside out. The moment the 6th shot echoed through the line, his body responded before his thoughts could catch up. Years of Delta Force muscle memory surging to the surface as his hands snatched the keys off the counter, his feet pounding toward the garage in bare urgency. The kitchen light still glowed behind him, casting a soft halo over the spilled mug and overturned chair. But he didn't look back, not once, not even as the rain roared outside like a warning. He reversed out of the driveway in a single motion, tires screeching against wet concrete, and turned sharply onto Parkwood Lane, heading north toward Brentmore. His phone, still on speaker, lay in the cup holder, emitting only static now. No voice, no breath, just the faint trace of life lost in a digital void. He gripped the wheel, tighter jaw clenched the edges of his vision, narrowing not from panic but from something colder, something sharper. "Hold on, baby," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine and the hiss of rain on glass. "I'm coming. Just hold on." The streets blurred around him, each street lamp a smear of light in the storm, each red light a suggestion, not a rule. He crossed 3 intersections without stopping, weaving between vehicles, with the precision of a man who'd once driven armored convoys through war zones, only now the enemy was homegrown, and the mission was personal. His chest tightened as he turned onto Oakwood and saw the flashing lights up ahead, 2 squad cars, an ambulance, and a growing crowd of neighbors huddled beneath umbrellas and camera phones, the air thick with confusion, and something far more dangerous, silence. He didn't park. He didn't hesitate. The car skidded to a stop at the far edge of the scene, and Darius leapt out, his scrubs soaked instantly, the cold cutting through fabric and flesh like wire. He shoved past the first 2 bystanders' eyes scanning for the Lexus, and there it was, its driver's side door still ajar. The windshield cracked, the dashboard splattered with something too dark to be rain. His daughter's car, his daughter. "I'm her father!" he shouted, voice rising above the din of sirens and murmurs, credentials in hand, badge from the trauma center still clipped to his waistband. "I'm a physician! Let me through!" 2 officers stepped forward to block him, hands raised, postures firm, not out of protocol but something more primal, more territorial. "You need to step back, sir," one of them said, fingers inching toward his holster. "This is an active scene." Darius looked past them and saw the paramedics lift Autumn's body from the car, her blouse no longer cream, but soaked in crimson, her hand still loosely gripping the edge of her wallet. Her eyes were closed, her mouth parted slightly, and her skin, oh God, her skin had that stillness he'd seen too many times in too many operating rooms. "No pulse," one paramedic muttered to the other, shaking his head. "She's gone." Something inside Darius broke, not with noise or drama, but with terrifying calm. The version of himself that had stood beside his daughter's bed as she practiced piano, the man who'd memorized every speech she ever gave at school, the one who'd taught her how to change a tire and tie a double knot, that man vanished in the rain. What remained was a machine trained and lethal, driven, not by vengeance but by a singular purpose: to neutralize the threat. He moved like water, silent, efficient, unstoppable. The 2 officers in his path dropped in under 3 seconds, one with a pressure point strike to the brachial plexus, the other with a sweeping leg maneuver that left him gasping on the pavement. No broken bones, no fatal injuries, just disabled, just out of the way. Darius advanced toward the man standing near the squad car, talking animatedly, with another officer, broad-shouldered, square jaw, a smirk on his face that disappeared the moment he turned and saw Darius coming. It was Sergeant Kyle Rourke, the one who'd fired the shots. His expression changed in an instant from annoyance to recognition to fear. "Sir, stop right there," Rourke barked, drawing his weapon, the same one still warm from Autumn's blood. But Darius didn't stop. He stepped into the line of fire, moved off-center, twisted the gun from Rourke's grip with a wrist lock that shattered bone, and spun the weapon into his own hand without a second thought. The crowd gasped. Cameras shifted. The rain didn't let up. With eyes locked on Rourke's face, Darius raised the gun, not to the head, not to the throat, but to the shoulder just below the clavicle, a precise location where a shot would drop a man without killing him. He pulled the trigger once. The impact knocked Rourke backward, crumpling him against the cruiser's hood, his breath-ragged hand clutching the wound. Darius didn't run. He didn't flinch. He simply walked toward the gurney where his daughter now lay, unmoving, the sheet only half draped across her chest. He bent low, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered something only she could hear, something too sacred for the rain, the cameras, or the law to claim. "She was reaching for her ID," he said aloud, turning now to the officers who surrounded him, their weapons drawn, their fear palpable. "You shot my baby girl for doing exactly what you asked." He knelt beside her, placed the weapon on the ground, and raised his hands, slowly, palms open, face carved from grief and restraint. They tackled him anyway, roughly with knee and elbow, as if he were a threat, not a father. The pavement scraped his skin, the cuffs bit into bone, but Darius didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't plead. There was nothing left to say, not here, not now. In the chaos, no one noticed the rookie officer Deacons standing motionless near the edge of the scene, rain pouring down his collar, his lips slightly parted, eyes locked on the father beside the broken daughter. He hadn't drawn his weapon. He hadn't moved. He had seen everything, and something inside him shifted quietly, like a house settling on its foundation after a quake. And as the ambulance doors slammed shut and the squad car pulled away with Darius inside, the rain began to soften, at last falling more gently now, like even the sky was exhausted from watching something so wrong unfold with such brutal finality. The booking room at the St. Louis Metro Detention Center was lit with harsh fluorescent lights that made every crack in the linoleum floor and every wrinkle in the officers' uniforms stand out like a flaw under inspection. Darius Whitmore stood barefoot, still soaked to the skin in blood-specked scrubs, his wrists bound behind him with plastic restraints that bit deeper with every slight movement. He didn't resist when they pulled him from the cruiser, didn't speak, as they led him down narrow corridors that smelled faintly of sweat, bleach, and stale coffee. And he didn't react when they shoved him against a wall and began their intake process, with the mechanical detachment of men following protocol they no longer questioned. He had trained for capture before, in war games, in simulations, in desert training exercises, where his mind had been sharpened against every worst-case scenario the military could throw at him. But nothing in his Delta Force past had prepared him for the silence of this moment, for the ache in his chest where his daughter's voice used to live, or for the feeling of being labeled a criminal, not for what he'd done, but for what he had witnessed. "Name the intake," officer said, not looking up from his clipboard. His voice was flat, like someone checking items off a warehouse inventory. "Dr. Darius Whitmore." He answered, his voice low but steady, every syllable clipped with precision. The title wasn't for pride, it was for clarity. It was a reminder, perhaps only to himself, that he was more than the orange jumpsuit they were preparing to force onto him. The officer glanced up, then brow arched as if the title were a joke, and said, "Doctor, let's see if your hands still look like they save lives." He grabbed Darius's right hand, roughly pressed it into the ink tray, and then slammed it against the fingerprint sheet with a force that was entirely unnecessary. Darius didn't flinch. He had endured worse. But in that moment, something cold settled into his bones. Not fear, but understanding. This wasn't about booking. It wasn't even about process. It was about humiliation. About power. About stripping away identity and replacing it with a number, a cell, and a story that could be written without consent. They made him strip under the glaring lights, each layer of soaked fabric peeled away and dropped to the floor like evidence of dignity abandoned. A cavity search followed, invasive and degrading, performed with gloved hands that never once met his eyes. And still he said nothing. His silence was not surrender but strategy. Every moment, every gesture, every breath he took was calculated, controlled, deliberate, not because he lacked rage, but because his rage had been trained to wait. They gave him a thin mattress, a plastic cup, and an orange jumpsuit that smelled faintly of ammonia. The jumpsuit was too short in the legs and too loose in the shoulders, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered in that moment except the image still burned into his mind. Autumn's face slack and pale, her eyes closed, her fingers still curled around the wallet she had never managed to retrieve. Inside the holding cell, he sat on the bench, bolted to the wall, spine straight, hands resting on his thighs, the military posture instinctive and unshakable. The other men in the cell glanced at him curiously, some with recognition, others with wary distance, but no one spoke. There was something about his presence, the stillness of it, the weight behind his eyes that commanded quiet without demand. Somewhere beyond those steel doors, the world was already spinning into motion. News stations were replaying cell phone footage of the arrest, omitting context and repeating phrases like violent altercation and officer-involved shooting. Darius's face had already become a headline: decorated veteran assaults, law enforcement after daughter's traffic stop. No mention of her age, no mention of her GPA, her piano awards, her volunteer work, just the word suspect repeated until it stripped her name from memory. Back in the administrative wing, officers discussed him like a curiosity. Guy used to be special forces, one muttered near the vending machine, took out 2 uniforms without breaking a sweat. Another chimed in. They say he shot Rourke Center Mass straight through the vest plate. That's surgical. They spoke with a strange mixture of awe and disdain, unable to decide whether to fear him or mock him. By the time they transferred him from holding to a private cell, it was well past midnight. The corridors were quieter now, the hum of the fluorescent lights more pronounced, the footsteps of guards slower, less urgent. His new cell was slightly larger, with a narrow window that offered a sliver of moonlight cutting through the darkness. He stood there for a moment, one hand braced against the concrete wall, eyes trained on the pale line of silver beyond the bars. A knock on the door broke the stillness. The slot opened and a voice said, "You got an attorney coming. Name's Charlene Price." The door slammed shut again before he could respond. He hadn't seen Charlene in over 10 years, not since Vanessa's funeral. But if she was here now, it meant someone was listening. Someone remembered. That thought, as small and fragile as it was, gave him something to hold on to. Darius moved to the bed, sat down slowly, the mattress barely yielding under his weight. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped, and let himself breathe fully, deeply for the first time in hours. He thought about Autumn as she had been that morning, humming under her breath as she tied her shoes, teasing him about his overcooked eggs. He thought about her laughing head, tilted back, sunlight on her face. And then he thought about the silence after the gunshots, the space where her voice used to be. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. And as the night deepened and the air inside the cell cooled, he sat still, as stone grief pressed close but discipline tighter, knowing that the world outside had already judged him, but the truth was still waiting to be heard. The morning sun had not yet broken fully over St. Louis when Charlene Price stepped into the detention center's outer lobby, a black leather case in one hand and a steaming coffee she hadn't touched in the other. The security guards at the front didn't recognize her at first, her silver hair pulled back tight, her dark overcoat slightly damp from the fog outside, but the badge on her lapel caught their attention quickly. "Legal counsel," she said, simply, her voice dry but unmistakably composed, the kind that didn't ask permission but expected access. "For Dr. Darius Whitmore." Behind the desk, a younger officer flipped through a clipboard, eyes scanning until he found the name, eyebrows rising slightly when he made the connection. "That's the guy who shot Rourke," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Charlene didn't reply, just stared at him with the cool detachment of someone who had once presided over federal courts and sent corrupt politicians to prison before breakfast. "I'll need a private room," she added, already moving toward the side corridor. "And I don't want anyone listening in. If I find a red light blinking in a vent, I walk straight to the press." The hallway to the consultation rooms was narrow and badly lit, the overhead bulbs buzzing like old neon. Each step echoed slightly, her heels clicking against the scuffed linoleum floor, her pulse steady, her mind already assembling the pieces of the case with mechanical clarity. She hadn't spoken to Darius since Vanessa's funeral 10 years earlier, hadn't seen Autumn since she was barely tall enough to reach the cookie jar, but none of that mattered now. There were cases that demanded distance, and then there were cases that demanded blood memory, and this was the second kind. They brought him in with his hands cuffed, the bruising on his wrists, already visible, a faint cut along his cheekbone, and a stillness in his expression that she recognized instantly. It wasn't resignation. It was war readiness, the kind she had seen in soldiers, in men who had learned how to pack pain into compartments so tight they didn't leak even when the floor fell out beneath them. She waited until the guard left, then leaned forward slightly across the table, resting both hands flat on the scratched metal surface. "You look tired," she said softly, not as an observation but as a way to remind him that he was still seen. Darius looked up, met her eyes with quiet focus, and offered the faintest of nods. "They didn't let me sleep," he said. "Not really." She didn't ask if that was from trauma or from deliberate noise and light that detail could wait. "I'm here," she said, "and I'm staying." For a moment he said nothing, just watched her, his gaze unreadable. Then, with a voice more gravel than tone, he replied, "I figured if anyone would come, it'd be you." Charlene opened her case and pulled out a file, thick already pages marked with red tabs, hand-scribbled notes lining the margins. "They're going to try to bury you, Darius," she said. No dramatics in her tone, just a statement of fact. "They'll use your service record, your training, your rank, twist all of it into a narrative that says you're unstable, dangerous, violent by nature. They won't call it racial, but it is. They won't say the words, but they'll imply you're a threat because you were trained to eliminate threats." "I know," he said. And he did. That was the thing about Darius Whitmore. He always knew the terrain even before the battle began. She flipped to the first document. The press is already spinning it. Local outlets are parroting the department's line, "Officer shot after traffic stop escalated." No mention of Autumn, no mention of her age. Just a still from your arrest and words like vigilante and militant. He leaned back slightly, jaw tightening, a muscle in his cheek ticking once. They erased her before the coroner finished his report. Charlene nodded slowly, her fingers pausing on the page. "I'm going to change that, but I'll need everything, start to finish. What you saw, what you heard, what you did." She looked at him directly. "No posturing, no stoicism. I need you to remember like a father, not a soldier." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward again, elbows on the table, palms flat, and began to speak, not quickly, not emotionally, but with the deliberate cadence of a man reconstructing a scene one image at a time. He told her about the call, the shots, the drive, the paramedics lifting Autumn's body, the officer's face, the moment everything inside him tilted on its axis. He described the disarm, where he struck, how he positioned the weapon, the angle he aimed. Every detail, clear, clinical, devoid of rage, but pulsing with clarity. Charlene listened without interruption, her pen never touching paper. She didn't need to write it down, not yet. She just needed to absorb it, to hear the truth before it passed through a dozen filters designed to distort it. When he finished, there was silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of something else, resolve maybe, or the first outline of justice forming like a shape beneath ice. "I'm going to file for an emergency injunction," she said, "to preserve all body cam footage, all dispatch recordings, all officer reports. If anything goes missing, we'll know who touched it. I'm also calling in every favor I've got from my days on the bench. There are still a few good people left in the system. Quiet ones, but loyal." Darius looked at her, then really looked, and something in his eyes softened. "You think I have a chance?" Charlene didn't blink. "I think you don't have a choice but to fight. And I think they underestimated who you still are." Outside the narrow window, the fog was beginning to lift the gray morning, taking on a faint golden hue where light touched the stone wall beyond the yard. A janitor pushed a mop down the hallway outside the sound, a soft shush-shush against tile, ordinary and unbothered. Inside the room was still two people sitting across from one another, one broken, one burning, both quietly preparing for war. And in that moment, as Charlene gathered her notes and closed her file, there was no need for grand speeches or false hope, just the shared understanding between two people who had both seen too much to pretend the world was fair, but still believed it could be held accountable. The air outside the detention center was thick, with late autumn moisture, a kind of quiet humidity that clung to coats and crawled into collars, making the world feel smaller, more still. Charlene Price stood at the edge of the parking lot just past 9:00 p.m., her phone pressed to her ear, her other hand buried in her coat pocket as she listened to the strained voice on the other end of the line. "They've already started," the caller said, hushed but urgent. "She's getting the threats. Not directly, not yet, but it's there in the lockers in the hallway, in the way they look at her now." It was Maya Langston's mother, speaking, voice tight with worry but too proud to let it show outright. Maya had been Autumn's best friend since second grade, inseparable in every way that mattered, and she had been there that night, just a few car lengths behind, watching everything unfold from her own rearview mirror. She had seen the lights, the hesitation, the shots, and she hadn't looked away. "She hasn't said much," her mother continued. "She keeps going over it in her head over and over, like she's afraid she'll forget some detail, or worse, remember it differently." Charlene closed her eyes, pressing the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers, letting the words sink in like rain through cracked pavement. "They haven't touched her yet, but I can feel it. You know what I mean? I can feel it coming." "Yes," Charlene answered quietly. "I know exactly what you mean." Inside the center, Darius sat on the edge of his cot, staring down at the rough floor, the fluorescent ceiling casting a pale glare across his face. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand, something smuggled in by a sympathetic guard, no more than 10 words scrawled in rough block letters. "Your daughter's friend saw too much. Careful, she doesn't trip. No signature. No mistake." It was a message as old as corruption itself. He turned the paper over slowly twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into the lining of his state-issued shoe, the way he used to conceal field intel during extractions. His face remained blank, unreadable, but his mind was anything but still. He knew the pressure tactic, knew the shape of intimidation when it started circling like a slow drone above the lives of civilians. It never arrived with a siren. It slipped in through phone calls that disconnected too fast, through strangers who stared too long, through bureaucratic delays and anonymous notes passed hand to hand. That night, as the halls quieted and the guards shifted to their skeleton crew, Darius asked the same officer who had brought the note a simple question. "Do you have kids?" The guard, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with weary eyes and a scar on his neck, paused for a moment, then nodded once. "A boy and a girl," he said, 12 and 16. "Then you understand why this can't go unanswered," Darius said, his voice steady, not threatening, just true. "She's a child, a witness. And they're treating her like collateral." The guard didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the floor, and then slowly met Darius's eyes. "I'll get a message out," he said, "but you didn't hear that from me." Elsewhere in the city, Maya sat curled into the corner of her bed, knees pulled up to her chest, the room dim, except for the flickering glow of her desk lamp. Her violin case sat untouched beside her chair, unopened since the night of the shooting. She hadn't practiced since then, not because she didn't want to, but because every note sounded like memory, every string like a cry she didn't want to hear again. Her mother stood silently in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her daughter with a kind of helplessness that felt like drowning in place. "You don't have to do anything yet," she said gently. "You're not obligated to speak until you're ready." Maya looked up slowly, her eyes red-rimmed but clear, her voice small but unwavering. "If I don't say it, they get to change it. If I don't tell the truth, she dies twice." That same evening, Charlene met with a contact in a parking lot downtown, beneath a broken streetlight buzzing against the night like a dying insect. The man waiting for her had once worked in internal affairs, now technically retired, but still very much in the know. "Your guy's case is already being shaped behind the scenes," he told her, handing over a thin manila envelope. "There's a narrative building. They're labeling him unstable, emotionally volatile, post-traumatic aggression. They're laying the groundwork to justify excessive use of force, both in the shooting and the response." Charlene flipped through the documents by dashboard light, reading the subtext between the lines. "And Maya?" she asked. The man hesitated. "She's on the watch list," he admitted. "Not formally, but unofficially, yes. They're monitoring her movements, her phone activity, probably her family's bank records. It's how they apply pressure, slow and silent." That night, as the city slept uneasily, Maya wrote down everything she remembered from that night in careful detail. The rain, the lights, the way Autumn kept her hands visible, the calm in her voice, the flash before the scream. She didn't try to make sense of it. She just wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside her mind before it frayed under the weight of fear. She folded the papers, placed them in an envelope, and gave them to her mother the next morning with simple instructions. "If anything happens," she said, "you give this to Miss Price." Back in his cell, Darius lay awake with his hands crossed over his chest, eyes wide open, replaying every second he had failed to prevent, every decision he now had to make, not for himself but for the living. He thought about Maya's small hands holding a violin bow, about the courage it took to bear witness, and about the quiet fury that builds in a man who's lost his child and still has more to protect. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, a plan began to take shape, not driven by revenge but by duty. Not to the past, but to the few still standing who carried the weight of truth like fire in their palms, too young to hold it, too brave to let it drop. And in that silence, Darius made a vow not to justice as an ideal, but to the one thing he knew was stronger than fear, the unshakable instinct to protect those who hadn't yet been broken. By the time the sun rose over the eastern edge of the city, painting the windows of downtown in dull gold, word had already begun to travel quietly through channels that didn't leave digital footprints or appear in official briefings. In a nondescript office buried 2 floors beneath a federal building on the edge of the Capital District, Agent Rodney Bell stood, staring at the wall of a soundproof room, his arms folded, his tie loosened, and his jaw clenched in that familiar way that told anyone watching he was working something out piece by piece. The file in front of him was thin, almost insultingly so, given the weight of what had happened. A traffic stop, a shooting, a father's arrest. That was the official story. But Bell, a seasoned investigator with a history of exposing buried misconduct, knew when something stank through the paper. He didn't come to that conclusion because of the headlines, most of which repeated the department's phrasing word for word, nor because of the chaotic clips circulating online. It was the silences that got his attention, the missing footage, the sudden media shift, and the lack of credible internal review. These weren't coincidences. They were gaps. And in his experience, gaps like that only existed when someone was hiding something big. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in years, and waited until a gravelly voice answered. Wilson. Bell paused, choosing his words carefully. I need access to any logs tied to the Sullivan footage, and I need it quietly. The man on the other end didn't respond immediately. You, stepping into that case, he finally asked. I'm not in it, Bell replied, but I'm circling it. What he didn't say but felt in his gut was that this wasn't just about a shooting gone wrong. It was the way the girl's name barely showed up in official documents, the way the father's military past had been reframed as a liability, and the fact that body cam evidence had been entered into the system and then quietly disappeared. Bell had spent the early years of his career investigating organized crime, and if there was one thing he had learned from mafia cases, it was that silence moves fastest when power has something to lose. So he began to dig not through databases but through human memory, through favors owed and bridges never burned. And slowly, like an image forming through fog, a pattern began to emerge. Back at the detention center, Darius Whitmore had no knowledge of Bell's investigation. What he did have, however, was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 12 covert operations overseas, through firefights and hostage rescues, through betrayal and dust and discipline. And that instinct told him the system wasn't going to play fair. The way the guards looked at him had changed, less hostility, more curiosity, like they were waiting to see whether the rumors were true. It was just after midday when the envelope arrived. No return address, just his name handwritten in black ink across the front. Inside was a single typed page, clean, unsigned. But the message was clear. Federal eyes are watching. Keep your head. The tide is turning. He read it once, then again, not because he doubted its meaning, but because something about it brought the smallest crack of air into a room that had felt sealed since the moment they slammed the cell door shut. He folded it carefully, tucked it into the seam of his mattress, and exhaled. Not relief, not yet, but acknowledgement that he wasn't alone in the dark. Elsewhere, Bell was sitting across from an old colleague at a corner diner, known more for its pie than its coffee. The windows fogged slightly from the heat inside, meeting the cold from the street. You're telling me Iron State's name came up more than once? Bell asked, leaning forward, voice low. More than twice, the man replied, pushing a thumb drive across the table. Every precinct increase in patrols over the last year lines up within a 3-week window of Iron State property bids. Bell swore under his breath. It was the missing piece, the why behind the pressure, behind the silence, behind the sudden urgency to discredit a man who had spent his life saving others. It wasn't about the shooting, it was about what the shooting had interrupted. Later that night, Bell returned to his office, and began a fresh file, one that wouldn't be seen by his superiors just yet. He titled it simply, Whitmore. He included names, dates, cross-referenced campaign donations, and highlighted internal memos that no one had thought to redact properly. When he was done, he stared at the screen for a long time, his reflection faint in the dark glass. He knew what this meant, knew that stepping into this would mean stepping away from the protection of silence. He reached for his phone again, this time dialing a number with a Virginia area code. When the woman on the other end answered, he said only one thing, "Tell the judge I'm in. And tell her she was right, this one goes deep." And back in his cell, as the city settled under the weight of night and unfinished stories, Darius sat with his back against the wall, his eyes on the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of electricity above. He didn't know who Bell was, had never heard his name. But he felt something subtle shift in the air, as if a new player had entered the field, not with noise, not with headlines, but with intention. And for the first time since Autumn's body had gone cold in his arms, Darius let his shoulders fall just slightly, as if the weight pressing down on him had lessened, not by much, but enough to breathe, enough to endure, enough to prepare. It was the kind of night that wrapped the city in a hush, not because it was quiet, but because everyone was waiting for something to break. Officer Matt Deacon sat in his small apartment, the television screen flickering with muted news coverage, the sound turned low so he could hear the rain pattering softly against the windows. He hadn't changed out of his uniform yet, though his shift had ended 2 hours earlier. His vest lay discarded on the arm of the couch, his service belt unfastened, but still within reach, like he couldn't quite bring himself to fully disconnect from the day. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, and something burnt from earlier. He had tried to reheat leftover pizza and forgotten it in the toaster oven, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, though his body hadn't moved in nearly 30 minutes, hands clasped in front of him, thumbs twitching, as he stared at the same loop of footage on the news crowds outside the courthouse, protesters chanting for justice, a grainy still of Darius Whitmore being led in cuffs through the rain. Every time the image appeared, Matt flinched, not because of the man in the frame, but because he'd been there. He had stood 10 feet away when it happened. He had heard the girl speak clearly. He had seen her hands, steady and visible, on the steering wheel. He had watched Rourke shout, "She's reaching," before Autumn Whitmore had even unzipped her backpack, and then without warning the world had erupted into muzzle flash and screams, and still somehow he hadn't moved. That guilt sat in his chest now like concrete, pressing against his ribs every time he tried to breathe normally. He had gone over it 100 times since that night, every second etched into memory like a scar he couldn't look away from. And still he hadn't said a word, not to his supervisor, not to internal affairs, not even to his reflection in the bathroom mirror. But silence, he was beginning to realize, was also a decision. And silence, when wrapped around a lie, begins to eat at you from the inside until there's nothing left of who you thought you were. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, screen lighting up with a text from an unlisted number. Just one line, "Check your email, and be careful who you trust." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood slowly, joints cracking the stiffness in his legs, reminding him just how long he'd been still. He walked to the desk in the corner, opened his laptop, and stared at the inbox. There it was, a forwarded thread. Attached was a clip recorded on someone's personal phone, not police-issued equipment. The audio was faint but clear enough. Rourke's voice laughing. "Clean shoot," he said somewhere off camera. "Didn't even flinch. These kids don't belong in that neighborhood anyway." The words hit Matt like a slap. He sat down hard in the desk chair, rubbing his eyes with one hand, the other hovering over the trackpad. He had known. Of course he had. He had known who Rourke was, before he ever rode shotgun on their first shift together. Every cop in the department knew his reputation, always on edge, always accidentally escalating encounters, always walking away with a pat on the back, and a new story about how fast things can go south. But no one stopped him. Because the system didn't reward truth, it protected patterns, and now a girl was dead. Matt stared at the screen for a long time before opening a blank message. No subject, no signature, just the clip. He typed out a single sentence. "This is what really happened." Then he addressed it to the only person he thought might actually use it the right way, Charlene Price. Across town, Charlene's phone buzzed just as she was stepping out of her car, the chill of the night making her shoulders stiffen beneath her coat. She opened the message and watched the video in silence, jaw tightening, as Rourke's voice filled her ears like venom. Her first instinct was to forward it to Gabriel Bell, but something made her stop. She needed to know if the source was willing to stand behind it. Evidence helped, yes, but testimony changed everything. So she sent a message back. Simple. If you're ready to talk, we're ready to protect you. Matt didn't reply right away. Instead, he sat in his dark apartment listening to the rain grow heavier, feeling the pull of fear rise in his throat like bile. He thought about his younger brother, a college freshman with a scholarship, and dreams bigger than their whole neighborhood. He thought about what it would mean to put a target on both their backs. But then he thought about Autumn's voice, that calm, clear, respectful tone. I'm reaching for my backpack now. He remembered how brave she had sounded in that moment, how completely certain she had been that following the rules would keep her safe, and he knew what he had to do. The next morning, he arrived at Charlene's office just after sunrise, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small envelope in his jacket pocket. His hands were shaking slightly as he stepped inside, but his voice was steady when he spoke. I want to testify, he said, and I want protection for my brother. If anything happens to him, this ends. Charlene nodded, once her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and grim recognition. We'll make sure he's safe, she said. But once you do this, you don't get to go back. You know that, right? Matt took a slow breath. I've already been living with what happened. That's not living. This, he paused, pulling the envelope from his jacket. This is the only way forward. Charlene opened it and found a full written statement signed and dated, along with a copy of the internal memo that had instructed Rourke to increase stops in Brentmore Heights. You kept this? She asked, surprised. I kept everything he said. Because even when I was quiet, I knew the day would come. And as he sat across from her, shoulders squared, but heart-pounding, Matt Deakins knew he wasn't just testifying against a man, he was testifying against a system that had rewarded silence and punished integrity. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally time someone told the truth loud enough that no one could pretend not to hear it. The break-in wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic, not the kind with shattered glass or sirens wailing in the night. But when Charlene Price stepped into her office that morning, something immediately told her that a line had been crossed. The door was unlocked, which it never was, and the scent in the air, something metallic and faintly chemical, felt out of place, like the residue of gloves or tools handled in haste. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she moved slowly past the reception desk, eyes scanning for signs of what had been taken, what had been touched, and most of all, what message had been left behind. At first glance, nothing was missing. The plant still sat neatly on the window ledge, the coat rack stood undisturbed, and the blinds had been drawn back just enough to let the morning light spill unevenly across the rug. But when she stepped into her private office and saw the file drawers open, some halfway, some fully extended, and one cabinet door slightly ajar, her stomach clenched with the familiar hollow weight of knowing someone had been here, not for money but for silence. She didn't speak. Not when she picked up the toppled chair. Not when she saw the papers on her desk shifted just enough to be noticeable. And not when she opened the drawer containing Darius's case notes and found them untouched, except for one missing folder, the one she'd marked with a single red sticker in the corner. The one that held early drafts of Officer Deacon's written testimony and a backup USB containing preliminary footage clips. Charlene stood there for a long time, one hand braced against the edge of the desk, her breath slow, and even her mind already sorting through possibilities. She reached for her phone and dialed without hesitation. It's me, she said. We've been breached. No damage, but it's surgical. Someone knew what to look for. On the other end, Agent Bell didn't ask questions. Shut down everything physical, he instructed. Backups, cloud syncs, whatever you've got, take it all offline. We'll secure new space today. Then after a pause, he added, they're getting bolder. That means we're getting closer. Elsewhere in the city, Maya Langston sat at her kitchen table, a bowl of untouched oatmeal in front of her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her mother was speaking quietly into the phone by the window, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, as if even the walls might be listening now. Since the threats had begun, their house no longer felt like a home, it felt like a checkpoint, a waiting room between safety and exposure. And Maya, though she didn't say it out loud, had begun sleeping with her sneakers on, and her school bag packed beside her bed. Across town, Officer Matt Deakins received a text that made his breath catch. Your brother just got pulled over outside campus. Minor infraction. They're calling it suspicious behavior. He's fine for now. It came from an unknown number, no name attached, but the intent was as sharp as a blade against the spine. He called his brother immediately, his voice tight, every muscle in his neck coiled with tension. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," his brother replied, sounding confused but unharmed. "They let me go. Said I was swerving, but I wasn't. You think it's about—" "You know?" Matt didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the answer, and saying it aloud wouldn't make it less true. After the call ended, he stared at the wall for a long time before opening his notes again, rereading his statement line by line, wondering which word had brought the retaliation. That afternoon, while the city went about its business, horns blaring, footsteps pounding pavement, people pretending nothing had shifted, Charlene received another blow. The law office 2 floors down from hers, where a former colleague handled immigration appeals, had also been hit. Same method, same missing case files. The only difference, their building manager claimed the security system had been undergoing routine maintenance at the exact hour the intrusion occurred. Charlene sat in the lobby legal pad on her lap pen, uncapped but unmoving. Her mind spun through every rule she had once believed. The system followed integrity, procedure, chain of custody, and now she saw them for what they really were, illusions maintained by those who had enough power to stay untouched. But that didn't mean she would stop. It meant she would go deeper, quieter, smarter, and she wasn't alone. Agent Bell called later that evening with news that made her blood run cold. "We found the source of the deletion in the Sullivan footage. The timestamp matches an access ID assigned to Captain Gregory Wilson, same guy who greenlit Rourke's last 3 transfers. It wasn't accidental." Charlene rubbed her temples slowly, the weight of everything mounting behind her eyes. "So we have motive. We have the act. But not the backup," she murmured. "Not yet," Bell replied. "But we're close. And someone inside wants it found. I can feel it." That night, a second break-in occurred, not in a law office but at the home of Jamal Robinson, the community organizer who had been compiling data on housing displacement and over-policing. His front door was kicked in his computers, smashed his notes, burned in the kitchen sink. He wasn't home at the time, only his younger cousin who had thankfully hidden when the noise began. When Jamal returned and saw the wreckage, he didn't cry. He didn't curse. He simply picked up the broken pieces one by one and began making a list of everything they had destroyed. 2 hours later, he called Charlene. "They think burning my files stops the truth," he said. "But I've got it all backed up, offline, safe, and I'm ready to go public." She closed her eyes, let out a slow breath, and said, "Then we move forward, carefully but together." As midnight approached, the lights in Charlene's office were off, but her computer still glowed faintly on her desk. Outside, the city lay in shadow streetlights, flickering the wind-scraping dried leaves across sidewalks that had seen too much in too little time. And inside, surrounded by threats and darkness, and a system straining to hold its secrets, a quiet defiance took root. Not loud, not flashy, but relentless. Like truth, unyielding even in silence. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning, not because the temperature had dropped, but because the mood had settled into something sharp and unspoken like frost on glass. Darius sat silently at the defendant's table, his suit pressed and collar tight, his wrists free now, but his hands still resting carefully on the wooden surface, as if the memory of handcuffs had yet to release him. The low murmur of voices filled the space around him, attorneys conferring, clerks shuffling papers, the bailiff giving directions, but he heard none of it clearly. Instead, his ears were tuned to the space just beyond the door where he knew his daughter's name would be called again, where the question of her innocence or provocation was still being debated in hushed tones by people who had never known her voice or seen her laugh. He didn't glance toward the gallery, even though he knew it was full supporters on one side, detractors on the other, and somewhere in the back, media lenses capturing every breath he took, like it might be evidence. The judge's bench stood tall mahogany, polished to a dull gleam, but the woman seated behind it, Judge Marin Fletcher, held herself higher than the wood could suggest. She looked over the rim of her glasses with a gaze that had weighed many men before him, but for the first time in his life, Darius felt that it wasn't just his service or silence being judged, it was his grief. Charlene leaned in gently, her voice just above a whisper. "When they call the first witness, don't react. Let me handle the tone." Darius nodded once slowly, as if he were still adjusting to this new world, one where truth had to be filtered through rules, one where pain had to be performed with restraint. The doors opened and a hush fell over the room as Officer Rourke walked in. He wore his uniform pressed and gleaming, his badge shining beneath the overhead lights. He carried himself like a man still convinced of his authority, but something in his posture betrayed the shadow that now followed him, a weight that wasn't guilt but fear of exposure. He took the stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth, though Darius noted the way his fingers trembled slightly before falling back to the rail. When asked to describe the traffic stop, Rourke kept his voice calm, mechanical, like he had rehearsed the lines a dozen times. The suspect made a sudden movement. I feared for my life. I responded accordingly. The words were spoken with such familiarity, such practiced cadence, that for a moment even the court recorder seemed to pause, as if unsure whether to continue. Charlene stood her heels sharp against the floor, her presence commanding without ever raising her voice. "Officer Rourke," she began, "were you aware that Miss Autumn Whitmore was unarmed?" Rourke blinked. "At the time, no. Were you aware she had announced her intention before moving?" "I don't recall hearing her say anything." "No." Charlene tilted her head slightly. "Then how do you explain the audio from your own dashcam?" The courtroom held its breath as she clicked a small remote. A speaker crackled, then played Autumn's voice clear, even heartbreakingly calm. "I'm just reaching into my backpack for my ID now." Then silence. Then the gunshot. A gasp rippled across the room, and Rourke flinched visibly. Judge Fletcher narrowed her eyes. The sound system clicked off, and for a moment there was only the hum of fluorescent lights and the far-off creak of a courthouse door closing. "Would you like to revise your answer?" Officer Charlene asked. He didn't speak. Sweat had begun to bead at his temples, and his hands gripped the edge of the witness box like it might steady the shifting world beneath him. Darius stared at him, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a depth of sorrow that seemed to hollow out the air between them. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. The truth was louder than any war cry could have been. Outside the courtroom, protesters lined the steps, signs raised high, voices raised higher. Some chanted her name, others simply stood in silence, arms locked bearing witness. News anchors framed it as civil unrest, but those who stood beneath the gray morning sky knew better. They knew it was remembrance. It was resistance made visible. Inside, the next witness was called an expert in tactical training, brought in by the defense to justify the reasonable fear standard. But even he, a man paid to explain away instinct, faltered when faced with the footage. "In a combat scenario," he said slowly, "hesitation can cost lives. But this wasn't combat." Charlene nodded. "That's right. It was a 16-year-old girl in a parked vehicle on a quiet street." Later, when the court recessed, Darius stepped into the hallway, the walls narrowing around him like a tunnel with no exit. His breath came slowly. He closed his eyes and imagined Autumn sitting beside him, her laughter echoing through the marble. For a moment he let himself remember not the tragedy but the ordinary, the way she always left her shoes in the middle of the floor, the way she hummed off-key, the way she said, "You never smile in pictures, Daddy, like you're scared the camera might catch your feelings." He opened his eyes, and for once he didn't fight the tears welling up. He let them fall quietly, not as weakness but as proof that she had been real, that she had been loved, that she deserved this fight. And as the gavel echoed from within the courtroom again, calling the court back into session, Darius turned and walked slowly through the corridor, each step deliberate, grounded, certain. Not as a soldier, not as a victim, but as a father standing in the only battle he had left to win. The courthouse buzzed with a low, nervous energy that morning, the kind that settles just before a storm breaks wide open. Rows of pew-like benches were filled with spectators, some there for justice, some for spectacle, and others just to say they had been present when history nudged forward or slid backward. Darius sat straight, shoulders square, but eyes heavy, watching the empty witness chair like it was a battlefield he'd once stood on. He didn't move much, but inside, every breath felt like it had to crawl through the wreckage of the last few days to reach his lungs. Charlene leaned in beside him, her notes tucked into a leather folio, her voice low and steady. "Today's the key, D. This is the one that breaks their line or lets them regroup. Be ready." He nodded slightly, offering no words, just a clenched jaw and the faintest twitch at the corner of his eye. The room around them grew quiet as the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Marin Fletcher entered her black robes, flowing behind her like a shadow that commanded silence. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked over the top of them toward the prosecution table. The first witness was Officer Elena Cruz, someone they hadn't expected to flip until just 48 hours ago. She walked in with her hair pulled back tight, her uniform crisp, but there was a tremor in her left hand when she raised it to swear the oath. Darius studied her the way a tracker might read terrain, watching for shifts for signs of danger or escape. Cruz sat and cleared her throat, her voice thin but audible. I was in the car behind Rourke. I saw everything. And what I saw, it didn't match the report. A ripple went through the courtroom, hushed murmurs swelling until the judge raised her hand sharply. Order, she said, not loud but sharp enough to slice the noise. Charlene rose, not rushing, not grandstanding, just stepping into the space like she belonged there, like truth wasn't something to perform but to uncover. Officer Cruz, she began. Are you saying the official account of the shooting was inaccurate? Yes, Cruz replied, her fingers clutching the hem of her slacks beneath the table. He fired too fast. She didn't reach for anything. She said she was getting ID. And did you report this discrepancy at the time? I tried, Cruz said, but it got buried. My supervisor said the footage had gaps. I was told to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my badge. Darius's gaze didn't waver. He knew courage when he saw it. Not the loud kind, but the kind that showed up anyway. Hands shaking, voice cracking, but still standing in the light. The defense rose for cross-examination, and their tone was colder, surgical. Officer Cruz, are you currently under internal investigation for unrelated matters? Yes, she answered calmly, but that doesn't change what I saw. They tried to undermine her, to shift attention to her personal record, to raise doubts about her motivations, but she didn't crack. If anything, the deeper they pushed, the straighter she sat. And when they finally relented, she stepped down, not as a broken officer, but as a witness who had finally stopped carrying someone else's silence. When the recess was called, Darius stepped into the hallway, the noise of the crowd like a wave crashing behind him. Charlene joined him, her expression unreadable but her presence steady. That's a wedge, she said. Now we push. He looked past her, out the tall courthouse window, watching as a group of students held signs bearing Autumn's name, their arms linked, their eyes focused. She deserved this from the beginning, he said softly. Not just justice. The truth. The whole damn truth. Charlene didn't respond immediately. She just stood there beside him, shoulder to shoulder, watching the world shift slowly but undeniably towards something that might finally begin to resemble accountability. And when the bell rang, for the court to reconvene, Darius turned back toward the room with the quiet strength of a man who knew the battle wasn't over, but also knew for the first time the ground was beginning to move beneath their feet in the right direction. The wooden bench beneath Elijah's legs felt harder than it had the day before, though he knew nothing had physically changed. The courtroom air still carried that stiff processed chill from the vents above, and the fluorescent light still hummed faintly in the silence between voices. But today, he was alone at the stand. Not legally alone, Charlene was still nearby, seated with a legal pad and pen poised, but emotionally he could feel the weight of the moment settle entirely on his shoulders. He adjusted the collar of his navy blazer, took a breath deeper than necessary, and let his eyes scan the room slowly. Every seat in the gallery seemed full, some faces supportive, others skeptical, and a few leaning forward like spectators at a match. But he didn't care about them. His focus narrowed to the jury box, where 12 strangers sat holding the weight of judgment in their quiet posture and cautious expressions. State your name for the record, the assistant district attorney asked, her voice, professional but not unkind. Elijah Rourke, he answered, voice low but steady. Junior officer, 2nd Precinct. Currently suspended pending review. The courtroom rustled faintly at that, like a shift in the wind before a storm. The judge didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply nodded for the ADA to continue. Do you remember the morning of the incident? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Can you walk us through what you witnessed in your own words? For a moment, Elijah stared at the floor, not out of fear, but to anchor his thoughts. Then he looked up and began speaking, not with the rehearsed tone of someone coached, but with the quiet clarity of someone who had been carrying the truth too long to keep it buried. I was in the passenger seat. Rourke was driving. We saw the car stopped at the curb, engine off, girl inside. He said she looked suspicious, that the car wasn't local. I told him to wait, that she wasn't doing anything illegal. But he pulled over anyway. He paused. The ADA let the silence breathe before nodding for him to go on. He approached the window, hand already on his holster. She rolled it down calm, said she was just dropping off homework at a friend's place. He asked for ID. She reached into her bag slow, real slow, and said it out loud. Said, I'm just getting my ID now. I heard it, clear as day. Elijah's jaw tightened, his eyes focused straight ahead. Then he fired. Just like that. No warning, no command, just pulled the trigger. Someone in the gallery sobbed quietly. The judge's gavel tapped once softly, reminding the room to hold its composure. Charlene stood, stepping up for the defense's follow-up. She kept her voice low, even respectful. "Elijah, were you close to Officer Rourke? We trained together," he said. "He was like a big brother for a while. And when you told him afterward that she announced her movement, what did he say?" "He told me to shut up," Elijah replied. "Said it would complicate the story. Said nobody would believe me anyway." Charlene nodded, slowly, stepping aside to let his words settle into the room. And in that silence, every breath seemed to echo, as if the very architecture of the courtroom had paused to absorb what had just been spoken aloud. Later that afternoon, when court recessed for lunch, Elijah sat alone on a bench just outside the courthouse, the buzz of city life muted by the ringing in his ears. A reporter tried to approach him, voice overly sweet, recorder already out. "Elijah, would you say your testimony was a betrayal of the department?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Number. It was a betrayal to stay quiet." She opened her mouth to ask something else, but Charlene appeared beside him just in time, her presence firm without needing words. The reporter backed off, sensing the moment had closed. As they walked slowly back toward the steps, Elijah spoke softly. "Do you think it'll matter that they'll believe me?" Charlene didn't look at him. She kept her gaze forward, calm, resolute. "They already do. They just don't know how to admit it yet." Inside the courtroom was quiet again, the next witness preparing to testify, but the air had shifted. Something in the rhythm of the trial had changed. Not dramatic, not loud, but tangible. A weight had moved from one side of the scale to the other, and the balance, once fixed and tilted, now trembled on the edge of something new. And in that stillness, Elijah sat back down, not as the boy who had once admired a badge, but as the man who finally understood what it should have meant all along. The tension in the courtroom was not loud or obvious. It didn't shout, didn't stir chaos. But it sat in the air like static, charged and waiting. The jurors returned with a slow, deliberate walk, 12 figures carrying the unseen weight of consequence in each step they took. Some avoided looking toward the gallery, others glanced briefly at the prosecution, but none looked at Darius. Not yet. Their eyes remained fixed on a space just ahead of them, as though they needed one final breath before crossing into what came next. Judge Marin Fletcher's expression was unreadable as she instructed the court clerk to receive the envelope. Her fingers moved with the precision of routine, but her jaw was tight, and her eyes, sharp and clear, flicked toward Darius only once before returning to neutral. Charlene placed a hand gently on Darius's forearm, not to comfort him, but to ground him. "Whatever happens, you stay still," she whispered. "You look them in the eye, but you stay still." He nodded slowly, his mouth a flat line, his breathing steady but shallow, like someone trained to survive impact before it hits. The clerk stood, voice composed, but touched with something human. "In the matter of Officer Rourke versus the people of the state on the charge of manslaughter in the second degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A gasp broke from one corner of the room, stifled quickly, but enough to rattle the stillness. Rourke didn't move. He sat in his seat like a statue, beginning to crack the only shift, a twitch near his left eye, and a single involuntary swallow. His attorney leaned in, whispering something urgent and useless, but it was too late. The verdict had landed like thunder without lightning, final, unblinking, undeniable. Darius exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding his shoulders, rising, and then gently lowering with a kind of grace he hadn't known he had left. He didn't smile. He didn't shake. He simply blinked once and let his gaze shift toward the gallery, where a woman in her 70s clasped her hands together and mouthed, "Thank you." Judge Fletcher's voice returned professional and crisp. "Sentencing will be scheduled within 30 days. Until then, Officer Rourke is remanded to county custody without bail." Her gavel tapped once, and with that it was done. But not over. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned that pale silver of late afternoon, neither warm nor cold, just existing above a city that seemed to hold its breath. News vans lined the curb, reporters with practiced faces delivered quick headlines, and protesters held signs, but their chants had faded into something quieter, more reflective. Autumn's name wasn't being shouted now, it was being carried, repeated gently like a prayer passed from one hand to another. Darius walked slowly down the steps, not because his body was tired, but because his spirit was still catching up with what had just been decided. Charlene walked beside him, her heels tapping a calm rhythm on the stone. Neither spoke right away. There was no need. It wasn't until they reached the third step from the bottom that Darius stopped and looked out across the gathering. He saw Elijah, the young officer who had testified, standing beside a man in a dark hoodie, someone older, maybe his father. They didn't see Darius at first. They were staring off at the courthouse windows, at the place where reflections shimmered like ghosts behind the glass. Then Elijah turned and noticed him. Their eyes met. No words, no gestures, just a look that said, "I told the truth and you saw me do it." Darius gave the faintest nod, emotion so slight it might have been missed entirely, but Elijah caught it. He nodded back. "You want to make a statement?" Charlene asked quietly. Darius looked at the microphones waiting near the police barricade, their wires coiled like snakes beneath a metal stand. "No," he said. "Let the statement be what just happened in that room." She gave him a look, half admiration, half respect, and tucked her notes under one arm. They walked on past the barriers, through the crowd, and toward a quieter block where the noise of traffic returned and life resumed its usual indifferent rhythm. As they passed a mural on the side of a brick building, one painted hastily in the days after Autumn's death, Darius slowed again. It was her face surrounded by stars and branches, her eyes looking up and slightly to the right like she'd been caught in mid-thought. He stepped closer just enough to read the words someone had stenciled beneath her image. She shouldn't have had to be brave. For the first time in weeks, Darius allowed himself to feel everything: grief, exhaustion, vindication, rage, and that deep, aching pride that she had been his, that she had lived fully, even if only for 16 short years, that she had spoken clearly, that she had reached for her ID with a voice steady and respectful, and that the world now knew what had happened next. She shouldn't have had to be brave, he repeated softly, almost to himself. Charlene stood beside him, looking up at the mural, her arms folded loosely. "No," she said. But she was. They stayed there for a while, just two people in the shadow of something bigger than themselves, neither rushing to leave nor reaching for the next step. And when they finally turned away, the wind picked up slightly, brushing past the buildings and into the street, lifting a single paper flyer from the sidewalk and sending it tumbling through the air like a forgotten thought made visible again. The night air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavier than the last. Darius stood alone on his back porch, a steaming mug of black coffee cradled in both hands, not because he needed the caffeine, but because he needed something warm to hold. The porch light buzzed softly above him, drawing a slow, erratic moth into its orbit. Beyond the yard, past the low wooden fence, the neighborhood was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt suspended, like even the wind was holding its breath. Inside, the television hummed with low-volume news, Charlene's voice echoing in clips from earlier that day. Darius didn't watch it. He already knew what she said. He had lived every sentence. He took a slow sip and glanced toward the far end of the yard where Autumn used to run through the sprinkler barefoot, her laughter rising like music that could shatter any silence. The memory wasn't sharp, not tonight. It drifted softly across his mind like mist, across a field, settling rather than slicing. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "You should try to rest," a voice said gently. It was Reggie, his brother, older by 3 years, visiting from North Carolina. He had arrived that afternoon without announcement, just a nod, a duffel bag, and a short. "Didn't want you sitting in this alone." Darius didn't look back, just nodded. "I will. Just not yet." Reggie stepped out onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath his boots. He didn't say anything more right away. Instead, he leaned on the railing and looked out into the same darkness. "You did what you came to do. You stood up for her." "Not enough," Darius said, his voice quiet. "I can't stop thinking about how fast it happened. How 1 second she was just being herself, and the next she was gone." There was no immediate reply. Just the chirping of cicadas and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog echoing through the night like a ghost trying to find its way home. Finally, Reggie exhaled through his nose. "You ever think maybe justice isn't a moment? Maybe it's a direction, a path we walk, even if it hurts?" Darius gave a small, humorless chuckle. Feels like walking barefoot over broken glass. That's still walking, Reggie said. They stood in silence again, not because they lacked words, but because sometimes words were too small to carry the weight of grief. The mug in Darius's hand had cooled, but he didn't move. He kept looking out, eyes fixed on a spot only he could see. You remember that summer, he finally said when she scraped her knee on the driveway. Reggie smiled faintly. She cried like the world had ended. And then 5 minutes later she asked for ice cream. She was tough, Darius said, eyes glistening in the porch light. But she didn't know she'd need to be. Inside, the television shifted to a new segment footage of the protest march in Autumn's name. The sea of people holding candles, signs, and silence. Their faces glowed in the light, but their eyes carried the storm. It played on loop, a reminder that though one chapter had closed, the story refused to be shelved. Reggie looked through the screen door, then back at his brother. You ever gonna tell her mother? Darius hesitated, then nodded. Tomorrow. I owe her more than a text. She gonna be all right? She's stronger than people give her credit for. Always has been. But this, he trailed off, voice catching. This broke something in both of us. Reggie didn't push further. He just nodded the way men sometimes do when they know some wounds don't ask for advice, they just ask for company. A breeze finally stirred, rustling the branches of the big oak in the corner of the yard, the same tree Autumn had once climbed to prove she could beat the neighborhood boys in height and nerve. It swayed now like an old sentinel, bearing witness to everything that had been lost and everything that still stood. I don't know how to be normal after this, Darius admitted, finally letting his voice crack just enough to make the words feel real. Reggie turned toward him fully, his voice firmer now. Then don't be normal. Be honest. Be broken if you need to. But don't disappear. Darius turned to look at him for the first time that evening, their eyes meeting in a silence more powerful than any conversation. There was no promise made, but there was understanding. And sometimes that was enough. The porch light flickered once and held. The moth continued its dance, brushing softly against the glass with the persistence of something that refused to give up. Darius stepped down from the porch and into the yard, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He walked toward the oak tree and stopped beneath it, gazing up through its leaves toward the stars that barely peeked through the night sky. I'm gonna plant something here, he said suddenly, almost to himself. Something that grows. Reggie, still leaning on the porch rail, nodded once. She'd like that. Darius stood there a while longer, the grass brushing against his legs, the cool air finally cutting through the heat of the day. He didn't cry, he didn't speak. He just breathed deep, slow, full, and for the first time in what felt like years, it didn't hurt to do so. The morning came slowly filtering through the thin cotton curtains with the gentleness of something that didn't want to disturb. Darius had been awake for hours, not restless, not anxious, just awake in the way people are when their minds refuse to shut off, even when their bodies beg for stillness. The air held a chill just enough to remind him that summer was ending, and something quieter, more reflective, was beginning to settle over the city. He sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper in front of him and a pen resting beside his thumb. The page was mostly blank except for a few names and times scribbled near the top notes about a scholarship fund he wanted to create in Autumn's name. He had no experience with foundations or grant applications, but he didn't care. He would learn, or he'd ask someone who knew. What mattered was that it got done. That some girl with eyes like fire and questions like lightning would get a chance Autumn never got. From the hallway came the faint shuffle of slippers. Reggie again, same robe, same sleepy face. You really don't sleep anymore, huh? He mumbled, scratching his neck and grabbing a coffee mug from the cabinet. Darius didn't answer right away. He looked out the window where dew clung to the blades of grass and the trees were perfectly still, as if they too were listening. I rest, he finally said. That's different. Reggie poured his coffee and leaned against the counter. You planning to testify before the city council? Yeah, Darius replied. They invited me to speak at the hearing on police reforms next Tuesday. I said yes. You ready for that? No, Darius said simply. But I'll do it anyway. Reggie nodded. That sounds about right. The rest of the morning passed in the rhythm of ordinary things, toast, dishes, headlines that no longer made Darius flinch. The world hadn't changed overnight. People still argued on television, fingers still pointed, and some folks still refused to see what was right in front of them. But something in Darius had changed. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was doing. By noon, he was standing in front of the community center, a modest red brick building with fading paint, and a paper sign taped to the front door that read, Hope is Action. He walked into the familiar creak of the wooden floors and the warm, sweet scent of lemon cleaner. Inside, volunteers were stacking chairs, organizing files, setting up water stations, preparing for the neighborhood meeting that evening. Charlene was already there, flipping through a binder. When she saw him, she smiled. Not the performative kind, but the kind that said, "You're here. You kept showing up." They printed the first flyer, she said, handing him a sheet. Autumn Dupree Memorial Scholarship. Open to girls from all 5 boroughs. Essays on courage. He looked down at the page and saw his daughter's face beside the header. The photo they used was one he had taken her standing on the subway platform holding a sketchbook, smiling slightly as if she'd just thought of something too clever to share out loud. "It's good," he said, his voice low and even. "You okay?" "I'm not supposed to be okay," he answered. "But I'm here. That has to count for something." Later that evening, as neighbors began filing into the center, old women with knitted hats, teenagers in oversized hoodies, working men in dusty boots, Darius stood quietly near the entrance, nodding as people greeted him. Some offered hugs, others just looks of respect, the kind that says, "You carried something we were all too afraid to lift." When the meeting started, Charlene introduced him without fanfare. "You all know why we're here, and you all know who he is. But what you may not know is that Darius Dupree didn't ask to lead. He just refused to disappear." He stepped forward to the mic, adjusted it once, and looked around the room before he spoke. His voice was calm, not rehearsed, not polished, just real. "I didn't come here tonight to talk about justice," he began. "Because, if we're being honest, justice already left the room a long time ago. What I came to talk about is memory. About what we choose to build after we've been broken." He told them about Autumn, about her art, her quiet leadership, the way she used to hum when she read. He spoke of the silence in their home, of the ache that had no language. And he told them about the moment in court when her name echoed not in rage but in truth. "There's no law that can bring my daughter back," he said. "But there are laws that might stop the next child from vanishing under the weight of a badge." The room was still as stone. Even the children had stopped whispering, and when he finished, he didn't ask for applause. He just stepped away and let the silence hold the moment. Outside, the sun had long dipped below the skyline, leaving behind a soft orange hue that stretched like ribbon across the darkening sky. Darius walked back toward his truck, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. He passed a young girl, maybe 11, maybe 12, leaning against the railing. She looked up at him and said, "I liked what you said in there." He smiled. "Thank you. My mom says your daughter was real brave." "She was," he said quietly. "She still is." The girl nodded solemnly, as if filing that truth away like something valuable. When he got home, the porch light was on, and a small package sat on the steps. No name, no return address, just a drawing taped to the front. It was Autumn sketched in pencil, sitting cross-legged under the oak tree, her eyes lifted toward a sky full of stars. Darius picked it up gently, stared at the lines and shading, and let his thumb trace the edges. Then he sat down on the step, the cool air brushing against his skin, and allowed himself one small thing, not grief, not regret, just peace. Not because everything was better, but because everything had meaning. And under the porch light, beneath the hush of a tired street, Darius Dupree closed his eyes, and for the first time since it all began, he let the night hold him without fear. Sometimes life hands us moments so heavy we wonder if we'll ever stand again. But stories like Darius Dupree's remind us of something powerful. Grief doesn't mean the end of our purpose. It can be the beginning of our legacy. In the face of unimaginable loss, Darius didn't retreat. He chose to remember, to build, and to speak truth, not just for himself, but for his daughter and his community. The lesson here isn't just about justice, it's about resilience. It's about how love, when broken, can still grow roots. When we feel powerless, we can still show up. When we're heartbroken, we can still protect others from that same pain. And maybe that's what getting older teaches us most, that the quiet strength of simply continuing, of doing the right thing when it's hardest, might just be the most powerful force there is. So if you're listening tonight, and you're carrying your own weight of memories, know this: you still matter. Your voice, your story, your courage, they can change the world, even in the smallest, most unexpected ways. Because healing doesn't erase the past, it gives it purpose. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.